Welcome to This Explainer. If you've ever lost an hour, or let's be real, maybe 3, just doom scrolling only to feel totally drained and anxious when you finally put the phone down, well, you are definitely not alone. Today, we're diving into the actual neurobiology and psychology behind our daily scrolling habits. We're looking at how those exact habits are converging to create what researchers are now calling a youth mental health crisis. So we're going to break down the specific mechanisms that keep us hooked and how they completely hijack our social development.
But to really grasp what's going on here, we've got to start with a fundamental question. Why does scrolling feel so remarkably good in the moment, but logging off often feels so incredibly terrible? We're going to connect your own everyday experience on social media with the hard science underneath it. Because honestly, it's not just a lack of willpower. It is a deeply biological and psychological response that has been very carefully engineered.
Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover, first, the digital dopamine machine. Second, a perfect psychological storm. Then, the upward comparison trap, followed by the self-objectification cycle, and we'll wrap it all up with breaking the cycle. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The digital dopamine machine. Let's talk brain chemistry.
Stanford psychiatrist Dr. Anna Lembke has this incredible quote. She says, "The smartphone is the modern-day hypodermic needle." Think about that for a second. Dopamine is the main chemical involved in addiction, right? Now, it was originally designed by nature to reward us for finding food or shelter or making social connections just to survive. But today, social media apps deliver endless novelty and social connections straight to our visual cortex. With the bright colors, the flashing lights, and AI algorithms that literally never run out of content, it acts like a digital drug. It completely hijacks the reward pathways that have kept our species alive for millions of years.
But here is where things get really tricky. When you get these massive, unnatural spikes of dopamine from checking your feed, your brain tries to compensate. It doesn't just bring your dopamine levels back down to normal, it actually decreases transmission to below your natural baseline. This creates what researchers call a dopamine deficit state. So the minute you log off, your brain plunges into this state, trying to adapt to the unnaturally high levels it just had. This perfectly explains why stopping your scroll usually leaves you feeling anxious, depressed, and honestly, just less able to enjoy normal everyday pleasures. We are biologically running on empty.
Moving on to Section 2, a perfect psychological storm. Let's look at adolescent vulnerability. Look at how these 3 distinct forces just crash into each other to create a perfect storm. First up, you have normal developmental factors, like going through puberty and having a super heightened sensitivity to social rewards. Second, you combine that with intense sociocultural pressures, especially the massive societal overemphasis on girls' and women's physical appearance. And then finally, you drop all of that into the environment of social media, which is hypervisual, public 24/7, and driven by quantifiable metrics like likes and comments. When these 3 pillars intersect, it creates this highly toxic environment that transforms normal teenage development into a literal public health crisis.
A perfect example of this involves a psychological concept known as the imaginary audience. Historically, teenagers have always gone through this phase where they feel super self-conscious, right? Like absolutely everybody is constantly watching and judging them. Well, in the era of smartphones, that audience isn't imaginary anymore. Adolescents know that at literally any second, a photo of them could be taken, uploaded, and permanently broadcast to a massive audience of their peers. The technology of social media has taken a normal, egocentric developmental phase and turned it into a 24/7 reality.
All right, Section 3, the upward comparison trap. Let's talk about the endless scroll. Back before social media, kids mostly compared themselves to traditional celebrities. Actors or models posing on red carpets in designer clothes. Distant, totally out of reach figures. But today, they're constantly exposed to social media influencers. Because influencers post content that mimics everyday life, they feel way more familiar and relatable than traditional celebs. They feel like our peers, but their content is still highly idealized and heavily edited. This creates a uniquely potent source of toxic, upward social comparison, simply because their level of beauty or fitness feels deceptively attainable.
And here is the crucial takeaway. These visual elements literally trick the brain. When a teenager is scrolling through a single feed, they're seeing a totally blurred mix of highly edited photos of their friends, celebrities, and idealized thinspiration or fitspiration posts, all side by side. Studies actually show that even when teens are explicitly told photos are edited, they still perceive them as realistic and really struggle to spot the digital alterations. So users are comparing themselves to entirely unrealistic portrayals that are packaged as everyday, normal life. And worse, they see exactly how much social approval these fake images get through quantifiable likes and comments. It's a recipe for driving deep body dissatisfaction. Which brings us to Section 4, the self-objectification cycle. What happens when we turn that intense focus inward?
81%. Let that sink in for a second. That is the staggering percentage of adolescent girls in the United States who experience at least some dissatisfaction with their bodies. It is a stark, defining metric of this crisis, and it really sets the stage for understanding how social media essentially forces young people to objectify themselves. This leads to a psychological phenomenon called appearance-related social media consciousness. Basically, it means young people develop this baseline preoccupation with how they might look to an online audience, even when they are totally offline and sitting alone in their room. They learn to adopt an outsider's perspective of their own bodies, which leads to this habitual body monitoring. This constant body surveillance and self-objectification, driven by the pressure to be camera-ready all day, every day, is directly linked in studies to increased depressive symptoms and disordered eating.
And you compound all of that with what we can call the selfie effect. When we take a selfie, we aren't just snapping a quick picture anymore. We are actively curating a digital persona. Research shows that taking, editing, and fixating on your own idealized digital image actually spikes anxiety and tanks your confidence. Adolescents learn to view themselves as a quantifiable brand, where their self-worth depends entirely on how many likes their curated selfies get. When they edit their own photos to fit some cultural ideal, they are engaging in an upward comparison against a flawless digital version of themselves, which, unsurprisingly, massively increases the desire to alter their actual physical appearance in the real world.
Finally, Section 5, Breaking the Cycle. Let's look at how we actually protect our mental health.
According to Dr. Lemke's clinical experience at Stanford, 1 month is the typical minimum amount of time away from our digital drug needed to fully reset our dopamine reward pathways. And yeah, I know, a full 30 days sounds absolutely terrifying to most of us. But just like recovering from any substance, a 30-day dopamine fast allows the brain to heal from that dopamine deficit state we talked about earlier. It drastically decreases the anxiety and depression caused by chronic social media use, and it actually allows us to enjoy normal, modest, everyday rewards again.
So here's the game plan to build a comprehensive strategy. Step 1 is the physiological brain reset, that 30-day dopamine fast. Step 2 is social media literacy. This means actively teaching young people to critically evaluate the media they consume, spot digital manipulation, and reject unrealistic ideals. And Step 3 is consolidating use. If and when you do go back to social media, restrict it to specific times of the day, ditch the apps driven purely by algorithm-based visual feeds, and prioritize tools that actually connect you with real people in your real life. By combining a physical brain reset with critical media education, we can literally untangle the neurobiology of addiction. I want to leave you with one final, provocative thought to chew on today. Take a really hard look at your own digital habits. When you pull out your phone to capture a moment, are you curating your life for an imaginary audience of online peers, or are you actually living that moment for yourself? By understanding the hard science behind the screen, we can finally begin to reclaim our dopamine, our body image, and our mental health from the digital machine. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.